Some good news for Sudan and the Sudanese. The East African nation's triple-digit inflation has dropped. The 387.6% inflation reading in August shows easing pressure on consumers is easing after a long period of economic upheaval. While this is still extremely high inflation, it is much better than July's figure of 422%. It's the first decrease since the 2-year-old transitional government took over after the toppling of former dictator Omar al-Bashir in 2019. The decline has been largely linked to stability in the country's exchange rates following a devaluation of the currency earlier in this year. That, as well as lower prices for essential food items. In January this year, Sudan's finance ministry pegged the currency at 55 Sudanese pounds to $1, although the black market rate remains several times higher. There are several things working in Sudan's favor as well. There have been various debt bailout agreements in the works, deals with some Gulf countries and the IMF. Sudan was also removed from the U.S. list of state sponsors for terrorism. Is this the beginning of a sustainable decline in Sudan's headline inflation? How are the deals reached for the country's economic future working out? We'll also be getting into the numbers coming out of Sudan. Today, our focus is on Sudan. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now, joining me on the show today is Africa geo-economic and macro-analyst Aly-Khan Satchu. He's also the CEO of Rich Management. Aly-Khan, welcome once again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So let's start with some of the numbers we've seen. We have seen a bit of a fluctuation with Sudan's inflation rate, slightly, not a lot, in recent months, but it has stayed at the triple-digit levels. It was 379 in May, 412 in June, rose again in July to 422, and is now eased slightly to about 387.6. Sudan is undergoing a reform program that's being monitored by the IMF, and it's been a very tough 2 years for the Sudanese. So take us through some of the main economic reforms that are currently happening in Sudan right now.
So, firstly, you've correctly mentioned it's an optically enormous number. Close to 400% inflation. I think the highest in Africa. Zimbabwe previously held that record, but their inflation has come off quite a bit as well. And really, if you're experiencing that kind of inflation rate, it's very, very unpleasant. It's very difficult. The cost of living is jumping practically every month. So this was a serious problem for the government in Khartoum. And there have been several riots and civil unrest. And this was something that Prime Minister Hamdok definitely needed to get a hold of. And I think what we're seeing is a trend change. We hope that trend now is as exponential on the downside as it was on the upside. The Sudanese, as you correctly mentioned in your introduction, have made tremendous headway in terms of dealing with the debt that they received after the demise of the al-Bashir government. Western powers in particular and multilateral institutions have supported the government of Prime Minister Hamdok in trying to resolve the debt through debt forgiveness and various other programs. But really the proof is in the pudding, and they need to see some relief on the inflation rate in order to deliver dividends to the average citizen. And I think we're seeing the first glimmers of hope that they can do that.
So these glimmers of hope, where are you seeing them primarily?
So, the turn in the inflation rate, I think, is a glimmer and a positive one. The Sudanese economy should be a powerhouse. It is very rich agriculturally. So it's surprising to me that food prices have remained so elevated. But I think we had extreme weather conditions in this part of Africa, which were not helpful. There's been flooding of late as well. So really, they have all the tools, in my opinion, to start to really see this economy perform. But obviously, they're coming from a very difficult place. I think with foreign investment beginning to come in, agriculture better positioned, a bit more optimism in the economy and support from global multilateral institutions, we should be seeing a significant improvement over the next 12 months. But 12 months is a long time in politics. People are in this kind of situation.
Yeah, very true. It's a long time for people who are striving to put food on the table. So let's look at what it might be responsible for this decline. So the decline has largely been linked to the currency devaluation, which happened earlier this year. So while the difference from July to August is just around 35%, and you're still in triple-digit level, do you think that the managed float of the Sudanese pound solely, mainly, or partially, or even otherwise was responsible for, I don't know if we want to call this a trend just of yet, but let's just call this a decline that we've seen in this figure that was released recently?
So it's a very good point you're making. I mean, the Sudanese pound was in free fall. The official rate bore no resemblance to the actual unofficial rate where most of the transactions were happening. And in those sorts of scenarios, you get these daily price movements because traders and businessmen can't price accurately because the black market rate is moving at such a fast pace. So it's important to bring stability to the currency. And I think what they did was they took the hard decision, something other African countries have not done and are going to suffer for those consequences. Nigeria is a good example. But what they've done is they've done what the Egyptians did in 2015, 2016, which is basically saying to themselves, we can't have these official rates. We have to find the true value of the currency. If we've got to take some upfront pain, we'll take it because we'll get long-term gains. And I think that's what they did, and I think that's the right decision. And ultimately, you will see the currency stabilize and improve, and therefore the inflation rate trend should continue in the right direction. It's critical to have a properly priced currency. It never works when you try and create these multiple currency points. It just means they're insiders who game the system and make a bundle of cash at the expense of the average citizen. So I think here, this was a bold move, part of the package that the IMF and the World Bank delivered to Sudan. And I think they're going to reap significant dividends. The question is how quickly they can reap those dividends.
How quickly can the people feel the impact? And talking about impact, we've also seen that the country raised spending by about 60% to 1.02 trillion pounds in 2020, and this is 2021 rather, as the transitional government was trying to somehow rescue the economy and move towards growth. Has the economy seen the impact of this increase in government spending?
No, I don't think it has. I think, it was a little bit like that Dutch boy putting his finger in the dike. The downside was so brutal that the government spending did not make a huge impact. It probably put a floor under the fall in the economy, but it has not impacted the economy as such, so that the average person would feel it. But I think it was necessary, otherwise you would have had cascade risks of serious downside tight. And I think they avoided that. But now really the key to this whole trick is to grow the economy, to grow the food supply, to bring down inflation, and start to encourage not only international investors, but most importantly, local people to start investing in their future. And I think once you get that virtuous circle, positive feedback loop going, we're all going to be surprised at how well Sudan begins to do.
Okay, Ali, let's take a break. But when we come back, we need to talk about Sudan being taken off the U.S. blacklist for state sponsors of terrorism, and also get into the Paris Club agreeing to cancel some debt. And let's see what the two may have in terms of effect on the Sudanese economy. We're looking at Sudan today. Inflation numbers are in. There is, of course, a decrease, but still with triple-digit inflation figures, there is a lot of work to be done. You're watching Business Edge. There's more right after this. Today, we're focused on Sudan as the country released a triple-digit inflation rate for August, but it was a bit of a decrease from the figures in July. My guest is Aly-Khan Satchu. He is an African economist and a geo-economic and macro-analyst. One of these days, Ali, I'm going to ask you to break that down for me. So let's get into this particular issue around the U.S. blacklist. Now, some analysts believe that the removal of Sudan from the list of state sponsors of terrorism is also helping the state to attract some level of new investment. So what is the economic link for Sudan, particularly for being, or right now in their case, not being on that list?
One of the most powerful tools of US power is precisely these types of sanctions, because essentially they cut you off from the global markets. And most of the world still trades dollars. If you can't clear your dollars, because all dollars clear through New York, you're essentially cut off from the global financial system. And for many years under President Bashir, this was precisely the position that Sudan found themselves in. And there is no bank, or there were some, but they got into a lot of trouble, like BNP Paribas. There are very few international banks who will conduct business with you under these circumstances. Multinationals cannot invest in your country, and it is a very draconian and effective tool. So essentially, by being taken off that list, it has opened up Sudan to the global marketplace and global investment. And I think, therefore, it is a very positive step. You've already seen positive spillover from that effect. International countries are supporting them much more. Previously, they were treading very carefully. And then also the likes of the IMF and the World Bank come in. So it creates a sort of stampede effect, a positive stampede effect in favor of Sudan, and is critical to their return to growth.
And another thing that's critical is also addressing debt. Now, the Paris Club, which has been quite busy with African countries in recent time, particularly because of the COVID-19 pandemic, they've agreed to cancel $14.1 billion in Sudanese debt and also reschedule the terms of servicing a further $9.5 billion that's owed to the group. Now, the country has made some strong steps towards addressing poverty and also reforming the economy. These decisions have also allowed the country to reach the decision point under the World Bank IMF enhanced heavily indebted poor countries initiative that was announced in June. So what's the expected outcome of the debt cancellation, the restructuring, and also of Sudan being part of the HIPC initiative?
Oh, so these are all positive benefits. I mean, firstly, the restructuring reduced the total amount that was owed and also reduced the interest payments and restructured the debt. So it was a win-win any which way you can look at it. It's a reduction in the total owed and in the cost of the borrowing attached to the total owed. And also then it created positive effects for the rest of the economy. So it's a win-win for Sudan every which way. And then putting them into the HICP is also advantageous because it gives them further benefits. So I would definitely say that if you just looked at Sudan from a balance sheet perspective, the balance sheet has been optimized, recalibrated, and repositioned. And therefore, that is a very key constraint. Now the question is getting more investment into the country, getting it back to GDP growth, a trajectory of growth, and making people on the ground experience a better economy. And I think everything is in place for that to happen. As I said previously, it's a question of timing.
So let me quickly go back to the currency. So in terms of the currency, there have been some suggestions that the central bank release more foreign currency into the market via commercial banks in order to meet demand, which would mean more foreign currency is then traded transparently via legal means than via the illegal parallel or black market. And a lot of people have pointed to the fact that Sudan, like many African countries on this currency issue, we're running so many different rates and there's a lot of lack of transparency and corruption in this. What do you think of this idea in terms of even cleaning things up and helping Sudan to present a more transparent market or financial system to the world?
step. I think, one of the biggest sins in African macroeconomic policy making is around currency management and the belief that you can create a fictitious level for your currency. Currencies ultimately move with fundamentals. If you're trying to interfere with that, you are going to cause yourself problems. And eventually what will happen is the currency will find its true value and it will be an awful shock for the entire system. So I think what they're doing is the correct approach. My concern would be, just how much foreign exchange do they really have at this point? I know that they did well on some things like gold, but they should be. I think they should not be flooding the market with currency they don't necessarily have. I think they should be prudent, and I think they should also move towards having one currency rate, and that's it. And this is something that Sisi did in Egypt. The adjustment was not pleasant for about 12 months, but since then you've had a flood of cash fly into Cairo because people feel confident that if they make an investment, they're not going to get messed up later on down the road because they will see a currency adjustment. So it's a positive step. I would be reluctant to go all in and flood the market. I would be cautious, but at the end of the day, I would be moving towards a single currency rate for which everybody can deal with and allow it to find its true value. And sometimes people worry, it's going to overshoot and it's going to go way off course. If it overshoots, it will readjust because people will buy it because it's very cheap. And you should not be worried about market operations. Overshooting happens, and when it goes too far, it readjusts.
As you said, the fundamentals. All right, let's look at this. So according to the finance ministry, higher revenue will be partly achieved for Sudan by increasing total tax gathered by 60%, as well as a planned five-fold increase in gold sales to about 100 billion pounds. Now, the budget targets reducing the inflation rate to 95% through the year. Do you think it's possible that before the end of this year, by some, I won't say miracle because we're having to see hard work and decisions being taken, but by some action, Sudan can get down to double-digit inflation before the end of the year? This is September.
That's a tough call now. We're nearly at the end of the year. I think, that's a very tough call. I think we're on a downward trend. I don't know how fast we get into double digits, but I expect that to happen in the first half of next year, if we're speaking realistically. I think at the same time, we need to see the single foreign exchange rate I'm talking about. And a few other reforms happen quickly. Gold, for example, of which there's a ton of it in Sudan, we all know that, but has historically been practically in private hands. And that's what's funded a lot of the unrest in Darfur, for example. I think they've also got to bring the whole gold mining business under state control. This is something Prime Minister Hamdok has been trying to do, but I think he's got to work harder at that. But overall, I think if you're looking at Sudan externally, I think they've made all the right moves. If there are opportunities for you to invest in Sudan, I would definitely be looking at them. I know the likes of Aly-Khan Satchu have been looking at the situation. The UAE and the Middle East historically has invested heavily in that, but I definitely think there's an opportunity here and that they are making the right moves, which is better than many other countries at the moment.
Let's talk about a projection very quickly. So according to the 2021 budget, Sudan's revenue is projected to grow to 938.2 billion pounds. The target for economic expansion is a modest 1% after the IMF estimated an 8.4% contraction in 2020. Do you think this projection is prudent? Is it just within the band of what you would expect, a very modest 1% of growth? What are your expectations? As you said, maybe the potential for double-digit inflation going into the first quarter of 2022.
So with GDP growth, I think there are two things I would mention here, and one's to do with the tax. I know they're trying to increase the tax collection considerably. I think they would be better off actually, and they've tried this, and I can see in their policy making, this is what they're thinking, is to actually reduce the tax rate on people and basically force better compliance. And when you get that happening, you get a virtuous circle of people thinking to themselves, well, I'm quite happy paying 10% or 15%, let me pay it. and you get much better compliance, and I would be encouraging them to think that way, because I think they'll collect a lot more money. Then I think with respect to GDP, I think 1%, they can outperform that if they get, for example, good weather. Meteorology is so important for our African countries these days because of agriculture. If they get lucky with the weather next year, they get the gold mining under control, they get people more excited about their own economy, I think they'll outperform 1%. But I think 1% is realistic at this point, given the complexities that surround Sudan. The one fly in the ointment, which we haven't touched on, is the situation next door in Ethiopia, where we've got a very, very uncertain scenario that is unfolding. And if that goes to an extreme where we see a serious threat to the Ethiopian state, the unitary state, then we could have negative spillovers at the border, which could then cause problems. But I think Hamdok for now seems to be able to insulate the country from that risk.
All right, so my final question is about the people. So there were protests after the subsidies on retail fuel and diesel were removed. And at the time of the measured float of the Sudanese pound as well, as we talked about earlier, it was hard. The measures, deemed harsh by many Sudanese, were actually backed by the IMF in order to enable the country to qualify for debt relief, which was in the country's best interest. Do you think the Sudanese have seen the worst of these tough times, or should they anticipate more over the next 12 months, 24 months, as these programs really take effect and we see more tough decisions, as you said, and many people have said that Hamdok and his administration are making in order to give Sudan a better future in the next few years?
So, the IMF always hate these sorts of subsidies that are, for example, placed on fuel prices, because historically it's not really the citizen who benefits from that. It's insiders who game the system, who take advantage of these subsidies and make a lot of money at the expense of the state. So, it's a twin-sided thing. The IMF demanding that they were lifted, the Sudanese took that pain. I've got to congratulate them on taking that pain. So yes, I tend to overall agree with you that things are going to get better in Sudan, that we've passed the worst point. The question is the speed of improvement on the ground. The average person, is the bread price going to go down quickly enough? Is the price of the fuel going to start easing up? I think they could do something clever with South Sudan on the fuel, because South Sudan exports most of its fuel through Sudan, and try and do a deal with those guys and say, look, let's see if we can take some of your fuel and pay you a reasonable price, and also provide cheaper fuel to our citizens. I think we've got to start thinking collaboration a little bit more intelligently at times. But overall, my takeaway is this is going to be an improving story. And over a 5-year term, it's probably going to be in the top percentile of performers in Africa.
That's some good news. And we need some good news, not just for Sudan, but also for the continent. Aly-Khan Satchu, thank you as always. It's a pleasure having you on Business Edge, and we'll be talking soon.
Take care. Thank you.
All right. And a few words I'm going to take away. He said that Sudan has been able to optimize, recalibrate, and reposition itself. Now it needs some growth. It needs drive. It needs something to push all of this work that's been done. We'll be keeping an eye on this, and if Aly-Khan is true to his word, in the next few years, Sudan may be one of the shining jewels in Africa's crown. We're going to take a quick time out. When we come back, we'll give you a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. And we wrap things up with NC4 to watch. And top of our list is South Africa, which has ranked 99th out of 178 countries in the 2021 Economic Freedom Index report released by the American think tank, the Heritage Foundation. Now, the country is up from 106 in 2020, yet remains in the mostly unfree category for the third time in a row. With an improved economic freedom score of 59.7 out of 100, Compared with last year, South Africa slightly missed making it to the moderately free category by 0.3% of a point. The Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa has approved a $1 million grant for modernization of Africa's aging hydropower fleet. Now, the African Development Bank Group says the grants will fund the mapping and evaluation of African hydropower facilities' rehabilitation needs. It will also support the preparation of modernization work for 2 pilot facilities to a bankable stage. This move is expected to add 200 megawatts in generation capacity, create 150 jobs, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 300 kilotons of CO2 annually. Third on the list, Nigeria's genomics research services and development startup 54Gene has raised $25 million in its Series B round of funding. Investors who took part in the funding include Pan-African venture capital firm Cathay Afri-Invest Innovation Fund, Adjuvant Capital, KDT Ventures, and others. Now, the firm says it will use the funding to bolster its efforts and expand further into the African continent. Funding will also be used to expand its capacities in sequencing, target identification and validation, and precision medicine clinical trials. And finally, the World Bank says it will discontinue its doing business reports on the heels of the irregularities in the data from China in 2018, as well as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Azerbaijan in 2020. Launched in 2002, the report was an annual perception index that's empirically assessed prevailing business climate conditions across 190 countries by tracking the life cycle of a small or medium-sized business. Now, the report served as the catalyst for economic reforms and investor decisions across the globe. And that's definitely going to be a topic of conversation here on Business Edge in the coming week. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to head to our YouTube channel if you missed any of our conversations on the business, financial, and economic stories coming out of the continent. You can also follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Welcome to a new week. Let's make it count.